are going to call to order these, Ordinance Committee meeting of January 28th, 2025. And if we could start with a roll call.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Present.
Councilmember Jordan, sorry, it's committee member.
Here.
And Chair Sneddon.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any changes to the agenda?
No changes to the agenda.
Thank you. And with that, do we have any public comment for items not on the agenda?
We do not at this time, no.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll invite staff presentation on street vending from vehicles ordinance.
Thank you. Afternoon, committee. Assistant City Attorney John Doimus here to make a presentation on street vending from vehicles. Also in the gallery, I have Chief Gordon as well as Assistant to the City Administrator Barbara Anderson to maybe answer some questions you may have. First, I think to start off the presentation and discussion is to point out some distinctions. We currently have a sidewalk vending ordinance under Chapter 9.49, and that is different or distinct in some ways when you compare it to vending from a vehicle in the street. The first key difference is under state law, largely for sidewalk vending, or just simply the act of sidewalk vending. You cannot issue criminal penalties for any of the violations. As compared to street vending, it's different. We can enforce, for example, on criminal violations as well as administrative. So there's more tools in the toolbox. And part of the reason is you think about it from a general safety perspective. It's one thing to have a push cart in the sidewalk. There are more inherent dangers when you're vending from a street in a large vehicle. So that's one important key distinction. And also in general, the law allows us to have stricter regulations, but there are also some similarities. And the biggest similarity is, just like with sidewalk vending, you cannot have a total ban. It has to be allowed. For when it comes to sidewalk vending, the prevention of any ban is based on state law, state legislature making a decision. When it comes to vending from a vehicle, that comes from court cases and preemptions from the Vehicle Code. And so we're proposing today a new ordinance to deal with vending from a vehicle, and that would be under 9.48010, and we'll get into that in a second. We previously had an ordinance under Chapter 5.32 that provided a blanket prohibition, as you see there on the code on the screen. It did not allow a peddler to solicit on any street within the city. So it was a total ban, but that code was unenforceable. It's been there for years, and no one enforced on that because of that. And the reason was based out of a case out of Anaheim that determined cities cannot pose a blanket ban from vending from vehicles. But the court did say cities can draft ordinances to do a time, place, manner restrictions, kind of what you have like with sidewalk. But to survive the scrutiny, just like anything when it comes to strict scrutiny on this issue, they have to be narrowly tailored, reasoned, and you have to tie them to health and safety reasons. We cannot consider, courts don't look at economic basis as a sufficient reason under strict scrutiny. Courts look at health and safety as a sufficient reason. So that's one important thing to mind. So if we had something to protect brick and mortar businesses, that could be held as a violation of case law. When we did this, Barbara Anderson was very helpful. She met with over a dozen vendors and also the downtown business community in terms of seeing a draft of the ordinance and looking at this. A lot of the conversation centered around time to vend and et cetera and the parameters. We were very careful when we crafted this ordinance because one of the things you will see is the guiding principles is that all of these restrictions are predicated on health and safety, first of all. The second most important thing is we recognize the legal right to vend, in the street. So that is finding the balance of having that right and allowing for that business model, but also placing in safety parameters, because again, this is out in the open in the street. We have regulations for everything. Think akin to land use zoning regulations for businesses, right? We have those in place. This is similar in that nature. So we are regulating it from, in some senses, a land use perspective, but not totally because it's not in Chapter 28 or 30. But we still need to have some regulations in place because our ordinance has nothing right now regarding vending from the street. Our biggest considerations when we are looking at health and safety is traffic safety, safety of pedestrians when we're doing this. One thing this ordinance does not do is regulate vending from private property, like a parking lot or all that. We do have that. That's in Title 30, as I have up there, 38185, on temporary uses. This is just public streets what this ordinance is specifically focused on. So here are some of the lists of the proposed regulations. So just like any business, we have a proposed time parameter, no earlier than 7 a.m., no later than 10 p.m. In order to not prevent congestion in one location, to prevent nuisances and everything else, because remember, this is business being conducted in the street. We have a 4-hour time limit, and you must move at least 500 feet. You can't just inch up in 5 feet and satisfy that requirement. So that's just making sure it's not always concentrated or congested and et cetera on that. There's no vending immediately adjacent to a school when it's in session. The health and safety idea behind that is to prevent kids from running into the street or causing any kind of danger like that. Another consideration too is no vending at a park or a public beach maintained by the city. And that's due to the impacts, you're adding commercial businesses in an area where parking and use is intended for recreational enjoyment of that beach. So we won't want to mitigate those kind of effects right there. Of course, an important regulation is no blocking for ADA access on sidewalks. The sales window must always be on the sidewalk side, so you cannot have a sales window on the street side to have someone standing in the middle of the road ordering any item. Vendors must always display their health permit for selling food and meet state law requirements that there be access within a certain distance of toilet and hand washing facilities. A vehicle must be fully parked before a sales transaction can occur, and then an environmental concern is not having it being operated outside of it, a gas or diesel power generator, as I said, for environmental concerns. There's also a prohibition on vending against certain streets, as you see up there on the screen. And the basis for that, again, is in looking with Public Works, the traffic engineer, and looking with the police department, we looked at streets that have heavily traffic or are narrow, that if you're allowing vending to occur, it would create significant congestion, significant traffic. So that's why these streets were picked in terms of strictly from a health and safety standpoint. And those areas are within the area bounded by and including Chapala Street, Mitchell-Terrena Street, Anacapa and Cabrillo. And then on Milpas Street, from the intersection of Milpas Street to Cunyendos Street, the intersection of Milpas and Haley. And then finally on San Andreas Street, from the intersection of Cannon Perdido to the intersection of San Andreas to Mitchell-Terrena Street. So those are where it's complete prohibition. There's no other areas in the ordinance where there's a complete prohibition. If in the future there ever was traffic impacts and we, long-term and study that issue, the ordinance can always be amended to address that. And then finally, as I kind of started off, the enforcement for, at least when it comes to vending from a street, there's a different range from infraction and misdemeanors. The vendors still must follow all parking and traffic laws, including the city's oversized vehicle ordinance. There's no exception to that. And then, unlike, as I mentioned, where enforcement must be administrative, we have more options. And again, think of the inherent danger too. You're not going in administratively when you're dealing with conducting business in a street with cars, large vehicles. We have more options just because of the mode of how this business is being conducted. And with that, myself and staff are available for any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Gutierrez, do you have questions?
Yes, thank you, Chair. How much outreach have you done to the existing permitted street vendors?
I'll let Ms. Anderson address that question.
Councilmember Gutierrez, we have been working with about 12 to 13 mobile food truck operators since last summer regarding impacts of unlawful food vending across the city. So that same group, we distributed the draft ordinance as well as highlighted some of the key takeaways that we heard from them last year when we met with them, which is they wanted more opportunity to know where they can operate lawfully in the city. Because right now it's actually very costly for them to work with private businesses, and they sometimes rent out those lots, again, for an extended period of time or duration. So they really wanted us to be able to facilitate more access for them. because, again, they were competing with the unlawful vendors that were impacting negatively their business revenue. So that was one takeaway for us to be able to move forward the ordinance. I sent them the draft electronically, followed up with folks who wanted to meet with me individually, and then I have some of their feedback summarized if you wanted to go into more detail there as well. And we also sent it to the Downtown Santa Barbara Association, and their board reviewed it and provided feedback as well.
So you got their feedback a year ago as opposed to just recently?
The direction a year ago in terms of the draft ordinance, and then we facilitated electronic communication on the draft. So I sent them the draft as is before this meeting. They provided feedback electronically to me, and I also had a couple of individual follow-up meetings because I offered to meet with people if they had any questions.
Okay, and one of the proposed measures of this is to limit the vending until 10 p.m. Can you just elaborate on the logic behind that one?
Attorney John Doimus can elaborate on that, but it is alignment with our noise ordinance as well.
Yes, Council Member, Chair, Committee Member Gutierrez. That's essentially it in terms of allowing with the noise ordinance and having such an activity past 10 o'clock, and also looking in line with most businesses and restaurants and similar like having similar hours. So kind of keeping it from what are the hours where you have a window where you're going to have less likely to have nuisance complaints, and so you're looking at that 7 a.m., 10 p.m. window.
And out of all the nuisance reports that we've received, how many of them are being caused by permitted street vendors?
I wouldn't have that information. I know right now that's the purpose of having this ordinance. We don't actually have anything in place for regulations, so we have nothing. If a street vendor is operating, if they're an oversized vehicle, that's one thing, but if they're just operating, there's nothing for us in place to point to where they're saying, well, you have your window on the street side, or you're blocking ADA access, or you're doing this. And so that's what this is intended to do, to at least put some parameters like we would in any kind of business, to at least regulate, to prevent that. So this is more the sense of preventative and having, kind of instilling good business operations in the use of our streets. That's kind of the main purpose to do so.
And Councilmember Gutierrez, through SB Connect, as well as direct communication with myself and the downtown parking team, I would say 25 to 30% of our complaints are related to mobile food truck operations.
Permitted ones?
Yes. Being in unregulated areas, breaking parking regulations, things like that.
Okay. Thank you.
So of course, and the Chief Gordon would like to add, to answer your question, Committee Member Gutierrez.
One additional statement to that. We
Just
get-
just a moment. Chief, I need to turn your.
Oh, I got it.
Thank you.
Sorry. Just one additional to that. We also get a lot of noise complaints after hours related to permitted mobile food vendors. So I couldn't give you an exact number, but it is something we've been currently dealing with, is a lot of them have music and other things going, and we do get those complaints as well. So in terms of, to Attorney Doimus's point about the 10 o'clock hour, and the noise is an issue after that time, so.
Thank you. And Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to try and walk you through page by page, John, some questions. So I'm interested in that 10 p.m. thing also, and I get the maybe light and noise kind of thing, but isn't there a constituency or draw to food trucks out there wherever they are for a late crowd? So, I mean, do we find that? Did we get feedback on that? I mean, when I drive around, if I'm cutting the corner to go home over the Mesa, certainly going through the west side, I see food trucks out there at that time, and they're not being utilized. There's people lined up at 10:30 and 11 o'clock at night, and we could talk further about where they are and how they're placed, but there seems to me to be a significant amount of demand for food trucks existing after 10 o'clock at night.
I think, and I'll let Ms. Anderson answer in a second in terms of kind of response. I know I've heard previous iterations or discussion comments being made to this effect, that it's a beneficial thing, or there's a draw, like you said, after the bars are closed and all that, to have a place to go. I think the distinction here is this. This ordinance is strictly regarding use of the street, so being on the street. So I think there also is an inherent danger when you're talking about 11, 12, 1 o'clock, having people maybe inebriated, everything else going into the street, vending. There is nothing, this doesn't deal with private property.
Right.
So I think what we look at is like, look, we need to have a cutoff line when you're talking about vending from the street. And if you want to do it past and have a draw, you maybe need to find like a private lot where it's safer for everyone, the pedestrians, people driving their cars and all that. So that'd be kind of what we thought and the kind of the response to that point.
So so you're going to hear me, like, I think frequently in all my questions, just worry about pathways to alternatives. So the pathway to the alternative to the late night crowd, if you're on the street, would be go find a private parking lot that would allow you to go through the process of putting it on there, right? I mean, like San Andreas Hardware. I mean,
Yes,
that's
Councilmember
frequently
Jordan.
there off the street and frequently there very late at night type of thing, right?
Councilman Jordan, yes, that's a potential pathway.
Okay. And then doesn't this, this big set of out-of-bounds areas that are commercial zones, doesn't that just push those people into the residential zones off of, say, off of Milpas or off of Chapala? You're taking the exposure that these food trucks bring to that area, then you're cloaking it in traffic areas or whatever else, but you're then pushing them, say if it was Chapala right behind us, you're pushing them a block, the next block or across street off Chapala, where the streets are smaller, the streets are darker, and into where people actually are living right across the sidewalk from the food truck operation. And so, I mean, could you just talk to me, I guess, and tell me why it's important to get food trucks off of every one of those streets and out of the districts in between them?
Sure, so it is a difficult balancing test. And again, one pathway is where you can operate from a lot. The idea is that these streets are the most, unfortunately, the most heavily trafficked because of that, generally narrower. And so the issue is if you're having it on there and adding to that congestion, adding to that lack of parking, adding to people congregating, that goes back to the health and safety. So the idea is in those areas, it could be a lot, or it could be adjacent to where it mitigates in terms of the traffic impact. So that's the thoughts on that.
Okay.
And Councilmember Jordan, I wanted to add too, that was also a consideration in terms of the duration of operations being proposed. We did contemplate a longer duration and a period of time, but again, trying to find that balance of allowing vending to take place throughout the city, supporting our mobile food truck operators, but doing that in a duration that would be less impactful overall for an extended period of time to the surrounding neighborhoods.
Okay. Then, just kind of a tangential question too. I think there's a section in there on noise, right? But I don't see a section in there on lighting. Is there a section on lighting? So again, we're in some cases pushing them out of commercial districts where there's a lot of people, a lot of activity at any time and at 10 o'clock at night, and offering them to go in to another area at 9 o'clock at night in the dark, but we're not trying to remedy flashing lights and neon lights and strobe light, which I've seen, or really bright lights also on a residential, what's equivalent of a multi-use residential street with a big set of spotlights beaming at the sidewalk and up into your house. Is there not a method to address that or try and remedy that?
Councilmember Jordan, that's an excellent question. The direct answer is we could add something to that effect in there, so we can definitely do that. We do have an ordinance in general when it comes to zoning laws on bright spotlights, but I think it'd be easier just so vendors can know the regulations and have it in one place. We can always add something to that effect in the ordinance.
Then a couple of your location languages are adjacent to a school, adjacent to a park. Are you going to define that better? Does that mean I can't park on the I can't do one on the turnout at Loma Alta and Shoreline above, above City College, right next to Shoreline Park? Does that mean if I go back up the street on the other side of the street, a block or two, can I do it there? What does adjacent mean?
Councilmember Jordan, that's a good question. We can also place in the definition. The idea so just so the committee understands, adjacent being the side that borders the park or whatever, so adjacent being on, so let's say if we're talking about a park, the street on the side of the park, if it was across the street or something like that, or down, I wouldn't. So we'll put in a definition section for adjacent.
And then help me with where we are with the oversized vehicle ordinance. I mean, we still have it. It's still applicable. It's in here as a bullet. But isn't every food truck already an oversized vehicle? So that just means they need to register, go through a registration process?
Councilmember Jordan, I don't know if every vending is or not within that. We still have the oversized vehicle ordinance in the books. In fact, and that's also for a health and safety reason. In fact, to allow exception for food trucks would actually kind of diffuse the importance of it if you're basing it off an exception off an economic reason. So we do have that. Now, if you do have an oversized vehicle and we don't allow them on our city streets, if you want to operate, again, then that would have to be arrangement through a private lot. But it's still operable in the city, and we still have that enforced.
So we have carve-outs for those, don't we? Like a FedEx truck or UPS truck?
We have carve-outs in the sense that, they're just delivering and they're not like, they're doing a quick, immediate stop. But in this case, you're not going to have that. You're going to have someone potentially being at one location at 4 hours, so it would still
So
apply.
if a truck meets those restrictions, it just can't operate on a city street, right?
Correct.
And so nobody's done any work to kind of determine if that's just fatal to 95% of the food trucks? Nobody's gotten out and actually just measured a food truck, height, width, and length?
Councilmember Jordan, it was my understanding that this ordinance helps, again, us define mobile food truck operations, vending from vehicles separate from oversized vehicles. So right now, our enforcement mechanism has been oversized vehicle ordinance when they're not abiding, by the parking regulations beyond that. But right now, this would help clarify that. We have commercial use of city spaces, which is the ordinance that we're amending right now, but this creates the defined pathway.
Right, but
from
what
I
I'm asking
understand.
is if that definition just wipes 90% of the existing food trucks you see out there off of the public street. Does anybody know?
I think I'm not understanding the question.
Yeah, we don't have any information as to how many are currently operating, or if the traditional size food truck parameters exceed the oversized vehicle
Okay.
ordinance. We don't know that. But with that, there is no exception with the oversized vehicle ordinance. If you're operating a food
Right.
truck, you still are violating that
Okay.
regulation.
My sense is most food trucks are at least the size of a UPS or FedEx truck, and I believe all the FedEx and UPS trucks have to go through the registration process under the carve-out. So I'd be interested in some case study information on somebody getting out and doing some measurements on the three measurements of some typical food trucks they see around town, and see if that's going to just be a wipe off the face of the earth of 90% of the food trucks out there.
Well, and we may see, like I said, we may have more information, because if I was right now, Councilmember Jordan, we don't have, like I said, an ordinance in place to enforce on. So it's been something that it's been hard to gather such information because we can't enforce on this. As we start to do this and get more information, we'll be able to look at greater numbers, and it's something we can always amend or see or always come back to. But right now, as I mentioned, we have nothing in place, and so with that, the data is very limited.
And I think my last question was on retail sales, on sidewalk sales, the limit of 10 days a year. So we're already saying you have to have a retail store, you have to do the sidewalk sales in front of your retail store. Why in the world would we limit that to 10 days a year when we're constantly looking for ways to activate the downtown and not live within the box of the building that's already there, but to actually put, do something out in front of the building, out in the street, wherever it would be, to activate it. So why would we limit retailers from being outside to 10 days a year?
Excellent question there, Councilmember Jordan. The idea behind there is, and it's something that, of course, the Ordinance Committee can weigh on, and as well as council, but just having some kind of balance limitation. I mean, if there is no kind of cap, then it could be an everyday occurrence, and everyone's doing it. What are the impacts for people kind of ingress, egress on the sidewalk? So that's basically the answer of why we at least have a cap, to just not create it where it's an everyday thing and it makes difficult travel on sidewalks and everything.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And then I also have some follow-up questions. And thank you, Mr. Doimus and Ms. Anderson, for putting this together and bringing it to us today. One question is about fire safety, and I think it mentions open flames or generators out on the street. Are there any additional fire mitigations we can put in place for within the vehicle itself?
In terms of the vehicle, Chair Stunnan, in terms of the vehicle, we haven't even looked at that, whether, what kind of mitigation there's. They would still be operating under the fire code, so we would probably rely upon our fire inspectors and fire marshals to determine, like, that is always fair game in terms of if they're violating a fire code in terms of their operations and all that. This ordinance is just more of a kind of parameters of how you're conducting your commercial business. So it's just like a restaurant. We may have ordinances dealing with sidewalk dining and everything else that we do, but then there are specific fire codes in terms of operations through our adopted codes, like the California Fire Code, et cetera. This ordinance doesn't preclude that, and I think, the fire marshal, fire inspectors can still use those codes to address any fire dangers.
And so is there a fire code in place for vending from a vehicle? Are there sprinklers, fire suppression within that, or is that within our fire code? I understand it wouldn't be, I guess, part of this ordinance, but is that already in place, or could we also be asking for that additional protection?
Chair Stunnan, I know there's just your general fire safety codes that would apply equally to sidewalk vendors that we've enforced on with open flames, that apply to vehicle vending, that apply to a restaurant or whatever it may be. I don't know for sure if there are, and we can confer with the fire department, if we come back to the council on this, are there specific regulations to vending from a vehicle or things that the fire department would like to see? And so we can definitely have that presented and answered when we come to council.
Thank you. I think that would be a good idea, because it might be different than, if you're serving chips out of your vehicle versus you're, building a whole meal with flames that the vehicle itself could ignite. Thank you.
Chair Sneddon, there's actually fire code around fire suppression systems, ventilation, portable fire extinguishers, use of liquefied petroleum gas, and other electrical codes that apply to mobile food truck operations. So we've since
Excellent.
adopted that under our municipal code as well.
Excellent.
So in general,
Thank
to
you.
answer your question, but we can come back with more detail.
Thank you. And that's already in place?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, regardless of where they're vending from. Okay, thank you. And then I had another question about noise, the volume. So sometimes, is it mentioned in here, or we're just using city ordinances on that, but what is the cap on the volume?
Chair Stunnan, yes, we generally we don't want to conflict with our general noise ordinance, our code. I forgot the decibel level that would be considered a nuisance, but there's a specific decibel level in our ordinance that would constitute a violation. So we would apply that equally.
And is that decibel level different if it's within a neighborhood versus if it's in a business district?
Our ordinance does take into effect when it talks about nuisance, and first, if you reach a threshold in a decibel level, that can be inherently a violation. But when you're also looking at noise impacts, the ordinance does talk about other factors in consideration, right? Is it a residential, is it late at night versus a busy commercial district? So yes, all those other factors are taken in place too, from an equity standpoint.
So that doesn't need to be in the ordinance, that would just be applied according to where the vehicle is operating?
Chair Senate, correct, that would be applied to where the vehicle is operating.
Thank you. And then I also had a question about lighting, similar to Councilmember Jordan, but also to flashing or strobe lighting, or, it being confused with a police vehicle or a siren vehicle, or causing, I don't know, kind of flashers in your eye that makes it difficult to keep driving. I'm speaking from my own personal experience. Is there anything on lighting that we could add to this?
We can. It's akin to, for example, our current sign ordinance does have a prohibition for flashing signs, et cetera, and for exactly the reasons you say, to prevent distractions and causing accidents. So that is something we can add along with the noise from because it's usually in the form of signs and all these things, these flashing lights, so we can add that, as well as the sign ordinance would still apply as well. So we have multiple ways we can address it.
I think that would be a good idea, especially for health and safety. I think it falls in that category. And then I had a question about, so not immediately adjacent to parks and other areas, but what about not immediately adjacent to police or fire ingress or egress, or not blocking those pathways?
Are you Chair Sunny, referring to like police stations or fire stations?
Yeah.
We could put in a prohibition on that too, in terms of not near a police or fire station or such, or a hospital area. We can do that.
Yeah, yeah, hospital is also a good addition. I'm just thinking about sort of the discussions we had about the farmer's market impacting ingress, egress from the fire station, and that if there's a truck or something with lights and it has sound, that it might also block that ability.
I'll consult with the police department, fire department on that, for sure.
Thank you. And then also not blocking public transportation, like MTD or...
And for that, generally, that would fall, Chair Snyder, that would fall under our general parking laws.
Okay.
Because you can't park near there anyway, so.
Okay. So all the general curbs apply?
All those still
No
apply,
blue, no
correct.
red, no MTD,
Correct.
et cetera? Okay. And then, is there any limitation on the number that can be operating on a single block at a time?
Chair Snyder, no, we don't have a number, and we thought about that, but then, again, having this, we balanced that by, why don't you being too restrictive with the fact that, you have this 500 distant and this time parameter, so we felt like that would at least be fair versus, and then think about enforcement, the complication of that, having an argument of who was here first and why, and so we kind of wanted to avoid that situation.
And Chair Sneddon, thank you for bringing that up. That is feedback that we received from the operators that we were sharing the draft with.
Okay. And the operators are in support of not having a limitation on the number?
Of having there be a restriction of the number of vehicles, and us communicating back as a city staff team that was the consideration, is that how to monitor that, how to enforce that. And we wanted to, again, create more pathways for operators.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then question about living wage or anything, working conditions for those who are working in the vehicle. I know restaurants have to comply with many of these restrictions for the health and safety of the workers involved. Anything in that for these vendors?
Chair Sneddon, it creates a difficult reason for, it's something we didn't look at strongly. We can take another look at, but I will say at the top of my head, two of the things that make it difficult are, one, a lot of it's preempted issue from state law or federal, depending on that. And the other issue too is the transient nature. Their principal place of business may not be Santa Barbara. They may be operating 3 hours at one period of time in Santa Barbara. They can go to a different location. So it's hard to have set rules in terms of, these employment working conditions in there. But it's something we can look at. But at least my initial thoughts on that is the difficulty for those two reasons. But we can look at that issue.
I think it would be important to look at. I mean, all the restaurants in town have to comply with those, and so even if their primary place of business is someplace else, they're doing business in Santa Barbara. So I'm not sure what the mechanism would be, but I think a living wage and safe working conditions are actually really important to include. Okay, those are my questions.
And Chair, on the other part that's hard on that, we also don't have so you have health inspectors or different types of things from the county and all that. We also, at this point, don't have the city staff to inspect or have the expertise in that area. So that also creates a huge roadblock on that issue. Just thought of that.
Thank you. And actually, I had one more question about the boundaries. And again, similar to Councilmember Jordan, it seems to me that these are safer on well-lit, wider arteries like Milpas Street itself, as opposed to the cross streets that are narrower. It's harder to park. People circle and circle to get spaces on that. The same with thinking about in the State Street area and between, these boundaries between Chapala and Anacapa and then Cabrillo to Michoacana. Those cross streets seem like they would be more impacted as opposed to like the artery of Cabrillo. And I'm just wondering about that in terms of the boundaries, that maybe it could be about the cross streets in those areas and not necessarily about the main artery. I'm just thinking of lighting, ability to pull over, gathering of people on the street. I know the ones on Milpas that are so popular, there's plenty of gathering around there and it's well lit, street lighting. So if you could comment on that.
Sure, Chair Shannon. At least when staff looked at this issue, we looked at it in terms of the most heavily traveled streets, most frequently used, and their kind of width and all that, and what impact, if you had this, would it create further impact or potential on that? You do raise good points in terms of the cross streets. It's something, if the ordinances committee wants us to take a further look at before we present to council on that, we can. But just to go through the thought process that we were considering, we were looking at just what are some of the streets where if you're having, we don't have no cap, we have none of these things occurring, and you had an influx, would it create a huge safety impact? And these are the areas that we were. So that's the thought process behind that. I don't know if Ms. Henderson or the chief want to add to that, but those were at least our conversations we had.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is any additional comment on that? No, okay. With that, Mr. Jordan, did you have further questions? Nothing? No.
Councilmember Jordan, I did want to confirm that food trucks can get permits that exempt them from the oversized vehicle ordinance regulations.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we'll invite public comment. I'm not seeing any in the room, possibly. Or do we have any online?
Chair Sneddon, we don't have any public comment in the room. I'll make an announcement for those who are participating via Zoom. If you would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand within the app. Chair Sneddon, we don't have any public comment.
Oh, thank you. I think we may have one in the room.
Oh.
I'm not sure if,
We just had a hand raised.
yes. So we can take a moment to fill out the speaker slip.
And we do have a hand raised.
And we do have a hand
We
raised.
do.
Thank you. And Ms. Grisanti, you mentioned that we have translation available? Okay.
I'll take it. Knock Vargas. And do you need translation services? No, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you have 3 minutes. Thank
Sure.
you.
Good afternoon, members of this committee. My name is Noe Vargas with El Pastorcito Food Truck, and I thank you for giving me the time to bring up thoughts on this revised ordinance that will impact or benefit my business and many others as well. Reading over the new ordinance, I did see some things that could be added so it does not create an issue between us as food truck operators and business or people in the community who might have an issue with us parking in front of their property. My first thought was to add a section so we as truck operators understand that we cannot have 2, 3, 4 trucks parked in the same location or on the same street at a time because it can create a traffic hazard or create a problem between the business or the property where we might be parking. Also allow us to have an exemption for the time limit parking for up to 4 hours stated on this new ordinance, so we can park in certain areas where we can benefit from the high foot traffic that we might not otherwise have if we had to park further away because of those time restrictions. Lastly, if this ordinance does move forward, create a pamphlet to be distributed to any of the food truck operators that has some bullet points of this ordinance, just so we can show the public or anyone who might confront us and let them know about this ordinance, so we can teach the public and inform that we have the right to do so. And then also, just to add to some different questions that you guys had. Like the food trucks that we operate is about 25 feet long. And we do, since we started our food trucks, we did have an oversized vehicle permit through the city. And then also as well, as far as the lighting goes, the kind of reasoning behind the spotlight was maybe for this reason too, is to create some sort of lighting where it can be dark on the streets for our customers and stuff like that. Obviously, the strobe lights is probably something that can affect or impact, drivers. But the spotlights is more to create some visibility for our customers and anybody else who's on that road. So maybe the spotlight thing can be something that can be revised to where it's not facing towards businesses or other properties, but towards, sidewalks and pointed, other ways around. And then also have a say in how a business or a property can change time limit zones on their lots and how far they can extend versus whether it's just in front of their property or the whole street. And because that's an issue we're having with a certain business in town. So those are my comments on this. And if we do, I hope that we can put this through, and it'll definitely benefit us, and so we can coexist with the community. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for your input. And we also
We have one online speaker, Natalia Gavoni. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. As a Milpas Street business owner, I would urge staff to really study a better option other than Milpas Street for these food truck operators. I think that it would be wise to actually put it in one central place on a lot that Mr. Doimus had mentioned, as well as Councilmember Jordan. Have it centrally located, where it can be easily monitored, not on Milpas Street. As several of you have stated, that street is heavily traveled. These food truck operators, those trucks are large, and they have always posed a problem with everybody else who drives and walks there. So I don't understand why the city just would not rent out or allow these food truck operators the beach lots, for instance, instead of Milpas Street. In addition, I want to echo what the police chief mentioned about noise. I think that allowing them to operate their food trucks till 10 o'clock, I think that's a little too late. And I think that's a huge impact, to the community. In addition, I want to also echo what Councilmember Jordan and Sneddon have both stated about the lights. They're too bright, and that needs to be worked out. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Ms. Grisanti, do we have any other public comments?
No further speakers.
Okay, so it's back to the committee. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm happy to move this forward for discussion with everybody. I think there's probably 4 more people here that are going to have 8 more opinions other than the 6 you see in the room already. But personally, I just want to say there is a place and time for food trucks. Discussing what that looks like is the fun part. But efforts to make a case that they are somehow damaging to existing brick and mortar businesses, I think, are a little disingenuous, because if you follow that rabbit trail down, or that rabbit hole down into its natural conclusion, we shouldn't be approving any new retail or any new restaurants because we should be protecting the existing businesses, and that obviously is not a really good policy. So I'm in support of getting these vehicles common and permitted. I think it's a move forward. I'll want to hear more, whether you bring it back here or whether you go to council, on the sidewalk retail 10-day limitation. It just doesn't sit well with me if we're looking for ways to both support business and just from a global perspective on energizing or activating specific areas, whether retail or food and beverage. And that seems just seems like we're making up a number to make up a number. And I also will want some more assurances that we're not saying there is a pathway for oversized vehicles for food trucks. It just turns out to be a dead-end pathway because somebody won't approve them then, that we do have some sort of reasonable accommodation for the trucks. More work on the lighting restrictions. I think those should be similar to if they're going into residential neighborhoods, mixed-use neighborhoods, then you can pull from existing residential lighting restrictions on, that the lights always point down, not, out or up, that type of thing. I mean, there's plenty of ordinance stuff you can pull from, but I think that's what you should be looking at, is the impacts that we create by having lighting are mitigated by the same type of restrictions that you would have in a neighborhood, neighbor to neighbor. I had on my list too, is a great point brought up on, I think, look at the number of food trucks in a space, so in a linear space or a block. So let's just say we're pushing them off of Chapala, but you're pushing them onto Coda or Ortega. Does that mean they all hustle over there before everybody gets home at 6 o'clock and they line the street at 6 o'clock and they get to stay till 10 o'clock and take up all the parking and the whole street is just food trucks? So I think go struggle over what that looks like, that we just don't have a line of food trucks taking over a residential street, the equivalent of a residential street. Better define adjacent, so we know what that looks like in some type of measurement. And then the other speaker too, I had this written down already too. We're like already years behind this on Uber and Lyft, on not having designated places in the downtown, so we don't have people like just pulling over anywhere in the middle of the street for Uber and Lyft. And other cities have done this in conjunction with Uber and Lyft. It's like you can't get on an Uber and Lyft unless you're in a designated Uber and Lyft pickup spot. All the same considerations you have, safety, lighting, vehicles, pedestrians, all mixing together. But why couldn't we also look for acceptable zones, particularly in these carve-out areas that you're saying are such a problem? I could probably walk for one Saturday evening and come up with some examples on Chapala or on Anacapa or on Milpas where there's extra space, where there's not a MTD bus running after 6 o'clock at night or something, and they have one of those little carve-outs in the sidewalks, and then make those some type of competitive raffle allotment or whatever to a food truck. And then they use it as long as they want to use it, then you just find somebody else, but you are putting them in a space that you pre-vet and find acceptable to remedy the concerns that the real concerns that you're bringing up on not putting those in those areas. I think that would be one answer to addressing there's a reason everybody wants to be there, because it's high foot traffic, it's downtown or Milpas downtown, whichever one, and that's where the customers are. And I kind of just look at that carving out of those areas as, hey, we're going to have a food truck ordinance, but we're going to so limit you that we're really not going to have a food truck result. And I think we should be looking at it as to how can we help them be in the places that are attractive to both their customers and themselves. at the end of the day, all these little things that are out there, they're only out there because there's willing customers. So, whether it's street people or food truck people, I mean, there are customers lined up to meet the need. So that's it, I think. So I don't know if that just mucks it up enough that you want to come back, or if you want to go to full council. It doesn't matter to me. I'm happy to move this forward.
If I may, Tristan and Councilmember Jordan, no, I think usually I would say we come back, but I think that the comments made today were really helpful. I think it's something that can be addressed. Some things can be corrected immediately in the ordinance, and I'll explain shortly what that is. And I think some of it can be addressed for fruitful discussion for the entire council. So what could be immediately addressed is obviously having the flashing distraction prohibition. And we can also obviously deal with definition of adjacent. We can look at, the fire safety elements and have that all factored in. We'll probably have to do a little work because while we have a temporary permitted parking for oversized vehicle under 1044, there's nothing specifically in the ordinance addressing food trucks. We may have to tie that in, but those are things we can have ready for council. I think the larger discussion for council and even for staff coming back from hearing today was, of course, are there streets that we should have a prohibition on? Is this something that we have all these other restrictions in there that try to keep for safe operation? Do we just abide by those and see how that plays out for the time being? And we can do that. The only difficulty challenge that I've heard in all that, I think, so all that's doable, all that can be presented to council. Most of it's cleanup, most of it will be a discussion for council to talk about in policy. The only difficulty one, as I mentioned, probably is the issue on a cap on a block. And again, that comes to an issue in enforcement because city staff's tasked with that. So how are they going to address who was here first and deal with that? Maybe it's something we explore with city staff on that, and if you're looking for police to enforce on that, you're also inviting a really, people's businesses and arguing like I was here first. We want to avoid that. We want to create a very amicable atmosphere, so we can discuss that. But the other things are definitely doable in terms of having the correlation of like the oversized vehicle, being more business friendly, looking at the parameters if those are needed, having adjacent defined, having the lighting, issue addressed, and then I think it was. I'll listen back to the recording, but I think I covered most of that. So yes.
So I'm not naive, and this whole mess just becomes an enforcement slog. And how do you do it? But I still just kind of think if we set a format or a criteria that 90% of the people will comply, and it's the 5% we have to worry about. If you do nothing, like in your example of how do we regulate it on a full block? If we do nothing, these guys are all going to think of this stuff before we do, and they're going to get out there first and do 5 things on one block in the funk zone and take up a whole block of the funk zone, one truck after another, right?
So yeah, and we'll look at that. And we'll talk to police. Maybe we have parking enforcement help us how they time cars. They can look. We'll see what options we have on that. So.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Chair. I'm feeling very conflicted about supporting these proposed regulations, considering that we're not adequately addressing the elephant in the room, which is, in my opinion, in dealing with the street vending in Santa Barbara for the last few years now, the issue is not with the permitted street vendors, it's the unpermitted street vendors that are causing havoc in our neighborhoods and with our permitted business owners. And to propose more regulation on business owners where the fundamental idea of this business is for it to be easier for somebody to provide this service, it just seems completely unfair and unjust and unequitable and just counterproductive. So again, it's just hard for me to want to support this, knowing that we're not addressing the real problem which is the unpermitted street vendors that are driving business away from these vendors, from traditional brick and mortar restaurants. And it's just something like, for example, no vending earlier than 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. There's some people in our community that have to wake up at 4 a.m. to get to work at 5, and there's no place that's open for them to be able to get food before they get to work. Most restaurants in Santa Barbara, most businesses close at 9 p.m. So to only give them an hour to essentially provide the service that most businesses are already not providing at that time, it just doesn't make sense to me, to limit them to 10 p.m. I understand that, this is all under the guise of making things safe, but I can't. It just doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it's fair. I appreciate city staff for bringing this to us, but these aren't the people I want to regulate. So I'm willing to push this forward to the rest of my colleagues, but I'm not supportive of what I see now compared to what the real issue is and what we've been doing as a city to address the more important issue that the community has voiced very much so.
Thank you very much, Councilman Gutierrez. And may I ask a follow-up question? Currently or proposed, how are we handling the difference in enforcement between permitted or not permitted, or would this help enforce against unpermitted, or what would be the impact with that between those two?
Chair Stein, and I'll also let Ms. Anderson contribute to that. We don't have a permitted process. So we do have the oversized vehicle. I guess we're issuing temporary parking permits. But as far as to operate, we don't have a permit process either for sidewalk vendors or for vehicle vendors. So some cities do. We've decided not to, require a permit and go through that process. You do have to have the business tax certificate, but that's not a regulatory permit. So the idea of having these permits and requirement is just to have operational rules through an ordinance. So that's what we have, at least currently. And so the idea is that right now, we can't do any enforcement via operational rules because we don't have an ordinance for at least street vending. So the goal was at least to have some regulations in place for safety. And so I don't know if Ms. Anderson wants to add to that.
I'll add that, in working with our mobile food truck operators, they have been intimidated working and operating in certain areas throughout the city because it hasn't been clear where they can be, what is accessible to them, what are the guidelines, what are the restrictions. So although it feels like more regulation, the way that our collaboration has been is that this also allows for a lot of clarification. So I met with Mr. Vargas. One, he had great ideas, and like Councilmember Jordan said, we've actually been talking as a city staff for the last year about city-led and hosted mobile food truck events. So I think we can revive that a little bit too. But we were kind of troubleshooting particular areas to vend or not to vend within the guidelines, and there's actually a lot of places for mobile food trucks that have the right permitting and license requirements can operate in our city through this ordinance too. So there's both sides. It creates some level of regulation, allows more enforcement pathways when people are not following those regulations, but it also creates more access at the same time.
Thank you. And just follow up, so those would be evenly applied?
Yes, yeah. And Chair Sneddon, the clarification is important in the beginning because there was confusion, I think, among a lot of the community feedback we received between sidewalk vending and vending from vehicles. And they are two separate ordinances. They have to be dealt with separately. The enforcement is very different on both of them. Our ability and capabilities for enforcement as a city are very different with those pathways as well.
Thank you. And this is specifically vehicle vending today?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I have some follow-up also, and I think we're closing in on some of the key issues. I also agree that there's a place and time for food trucks, and that's what this ordinance is attempting to address. I agree we need to address the lighting and noise issues, respecting businesses, neighborhoods, but also the safety of those walking by, driving by, particularly those sensitive to strobe lights and bright lighting. I think it's worth looking at addressing all that we can in terms of fire safety within the vehicles, within our purview. Specifically, also agree with the definition of adjacent, clarifying that. I'd like a study of the boundaries in terms of circulation on cross streets versus main arteries. If the cross streets are narrower, less parking, and people are circling or parking in unsafe ways because there just isn't as much parking, then I think that could be a health and safety concern. Recommend specifically naming in the ordinance not blocking police, fire, hospital, ingress, egress, so public safety. And then I like this idea of looking again at designated areas. And I think, maybe not for this ordinance just yet, but maybe that if we look at where we're designating a curb, say a hatch mark curb or something, where this is where it is a safe location for a food truck to park, then in that way it could be limiting the number on a block because it's showing this is a designated food truck area during these particular hours, and then it would be sort of inviting where they could be. And I think you could look block by block. On some blocks, it might be perfectly fine if all the businesses on that block are closed at 7 p.m. and there are no food vending, and that block might be a perfect place to have multiple food trucks throughout the night even. And so we might be looking at that, designating areas where to invite them specifically instead of blocks of areas where we're prohibiting specifically, if that's worth looking at. And then I think that could take into account the hours of operation, the lighting, and also the number within a blocked area. And maybe not everywhere throughout the city, but maybe some sort of hot spots of places where, we know the places where community welcomes them and where they do business well and where they aren't impeding health and safety in those areas. So I think it sounds like you have enough in our comments to bring this forward to council with those further considerations, and then getting particularly feedback. I want to be very sensitive to council representatives. So I would like to hear from council representative of the east side on what those impacts might be, specifically council member representative of west side, and then Mesa and downtown and different areas. So I think some of those bigger questions coming to council as a whole is beneficial. So
True, and Chair Sutton, if I may add to, generally with all these changes, I would normally advise that we come back to the committee, but I think we have the shell of what's needed, and these additions are really helpful, where I think a good, robust conversation that you and the rest of the committee today have suggested for the whole council to talk about. And like I say, the one form can change, and having maybe designated areas that go vending, that go beyond the hour parameters, the ordinance could have a little bit slight change where it takes the form kind of where we have like rules the city administrator promulgate, right? So maybe that, and it gives us more flexibility or, of that. So you'll have this ordinance, you'll have some changes, but when it comes to location and impacts and designation, that might have, just for the committee to be aware, that might have a different look in terms of what you see on paper today, but we will work on that.
okay, thank you so much. And Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm not supportive of subjugating the mobile food trucks to certain areas. Again, I think it defeats the purpose of that business model. I will suggest that an issue that keeps being brought to my attention is that some of these food truck vendors will purposely park vehicles to reserve spots for their trucks
Yes, yeah.
for days. So if there's some way we could regulate that, but to say, we don't want you in this area, go find this other area, we're just opening up we're just basically just kicking the can down the road. And I don't think it's equitable when people know, if I need something, I'll go to this part of town. So it just makes sense that that's where they'll be, but to push them into another area, I don't think is fair. So I just want to state that.
And Chair Senate and all members of the committee, I hope it goes without saying, community engagement, stakeholder engagement will continue prior to council. We've had great feedback in the interim, and we'll continue to meet with operators as we prepare for council as well.
Thank you. I was going to ask for clarification on that, so thank you. And Councilmember Jordan.
So I wasn't intending to use a big word like subjugating, but my intent was to offer certainty in areas that are either prohibited or certainty in other areas within also the allowance that the ordinance gives. So you get the blanket allowance wherever the ordinance is, but we can find some places to offer certainty for locations in there, whether they're kind of on my idea of other places or Mr. Doimus's ideas of where they shouldn't be. But I don't think they, I don't, nothing that I was talking about meets your narrative of what you just said by restricting. I find it more, okay, but I find it more that, that we're offering greater opportunity to put those food trucks by identifying places.
Thank you for that clarification. And I think I don't want to put forward the recommendation that we have designated areas. I want to put forward that we look at that, study that maybe that could be in addition to other places, so to provide that certainty and that sort of welcome of where trucks are, and may even be able to prevent holding cars in spaces all day. You know, it could be certain times where this is food truck time, and that's, you know, based on when it's already popular or meeting a need in the community.
And Chair Snyder, I'm just going to add, part of that look, we will look at where these regulations apply across the city, but if you have a designated area, because we feel that this is a space that, if you're doing it, has less health and safety impacts, that there's even more of allowance in terms of such regulations. And that's the kind of perspective, at least the guidance that I seem to get today from the committee they want us to look at. So that's what we will look at.
Yes. So I think bottom line is we want to allow them, and we want to provide certainty so that people aren't worried that they're operating illegally in some way. Okay, I think, do you have the feedback from this committee that you need, maybe even without a specific motion, other than to consider the feedback and bring it back to council?
Yeah, we have the feedback we need. It would be a long motion, so just a general incorporating the feedback received today from the Ordinance Committee and incorporating that into the draft before council. That'll probably come back, it'll probably be a couple weeks. It won't be a quick turnaround, but we will do that.
And while continuing community outreach and feedback. Yes, I'd invite a motion.
Okay, so I'll make that motion that we move it to council with our comments and incorporation where you think you can do it easily, but that you also ensure that some narrative of our comments is also part of that presentation to council. And your last point on continuing outreach for responses to what they've heard here today.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion from Councilmember Jordan and a second from Councilmember Gutierrez. May we have a vote?
Recommendation moved by Committee Member Jordan, seconded by Committee Member Gutierrez, that the Ordinance Committee consider the proposed amendments and forward to council with the exception of items that were addressed today. And I have those listed out. Okay? Would you like me to read those or just move forward with?
I think we can move forward.
Okay, wonderful. We can go ahead and vote. We'll do a verbal vote. Committee Member Gutierrez.
Aye.
Committee Member Jordan.
Yes.
And Chair Sneddon.
Yes.
It passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are adjourned.
Again.